Thank you, Miranda, for inviting me to do this, and thank you everybody for coming out on a cold January evening. I have a glass of wine down here, so this is quite a sacramental occasion. If you've had a glass of wine already, you might want to doze off in the middle 20 minutes, because it's mostly padding, to be honest. Before coming to Liverpool, we lived in Sheffield, and we used to do a lot of walking in the Peak District. And one day, we were making our way along a fairly wide path, which was once used by the quarries that shaped the landscape. And if you've ever walked in those paths, you know there's a lot of discarded millstones along the side of the path, just sitting there as evidence of what was once a busy industrial site. And ahead on the path, I noticed a line of ants crossing the path. A lot of ants. The line ended in a large mounded anthill. And then we noticed there were more lines of ants going in other directions. And as we traced them, they connected with other anthills. And we suddenly became aware of something. All around us, crisscrossing the path, and beyond, in and among the birch trees, there was a whole network of ant roads running between multiple anthills. And in that little moment, my whole perception of the geography of that space shifted. We had stepped into another world. It wasn't the pristine Eden of unspoilt nature. Like any landscape in Britain, this one bore the marks of human habitation. But nor was it an entirely human world. This was ant territory. Tiny movements had carved furrows, quite deep furrows, signs of passage, communication networks into the soil, the grass and the moss. Unconcerned by us stomping around above, they were busy writing the book of their own world, their traces shaping the land around us. This was no longer our world. It was a much stranger place, and one at once fascinating, to be honest, unsettling. I was reminded of this last week when I read of another ant-related discovery. Don't worry, it's not all about ants. 80%. A new aphid, the giant pale aphid, has been discovered. And one reason the giant pale aphid has not been observed for so long is that it is farmed by brown ants. The ants herd the aphids, milk them by extracting their honeydew, and even build shelters for them out of the exoskeletons of dead beetles. If disturbed, the ants drive the aphids into holes in their oak tree homes. And what strikes us again, I think, is that uncanny blend of the familiar and the strange. Seen through human eyes, the ants have roads and farms just like us. And yet we know that ant life is utterly different in scale, nature and intention to ours. The ant escapes the frame of our knowing, even as we stand among its traces. We stand there before the other. And who would not say, "Oh my God"? The beginning of prayer is the fear of ants. I could say I'm being flippant, but really I'm not. And I want to spend the next 40 minutes or so exploring the implications of this kind of experience and what it has to do with my motivation for writing the prayers in The Earth Cries Glory. So there are 4 sections to what I want to say. First, I'm going to say something about the word I used in the title of the talk, rewilding. Rewilding has become an increasingly important aspect of the debate about how we reverse the devastating loss of biodiversity we've seen in the UK and many other places across the world. It's still in the process of being developed, and it's both promising and controversial. I want to suggest why I think rewilding as a practice and as a metaphor is something we need to learn from theologically and spiritually. And second, I'll explore some of the existing ways in which theology has attempted to respond to the ecological emergencies of our age. Obviously, this can only scratch the surface, but I want to draw out what I think is one of the most important creative tensions in this debate. The tension happens when we move beyond simply extending Christian care from humans to non-humans and wider nature, but in doing so, we allow the experience of the non-human to question, interrupt, and reshape our ideas of what is divine. How do we speak of God in the language of creation, when that language is made up of the signs and traces left by the non-human? Third, I want briefly to develop that thought a little bit more constructively by turning to an unlikely source, the mystical thinking and writing of the Middle Ages, and specifically of Margaret Porete. I'll suggest we need to turn to that tradition again, that we need to confront the ongoing Christian anxiety about pantheism. Somebody was interrogating me about pantheism earlier on, and paganism, and have the boldness of our 13th century brothers and sisters in experimenting with the divine. And I'll end by connecting this briefly to the writing of the book and to the prayerful work of crossing boundaries between pagan and Christian, human and non-human, earth and spirit. So part one is rewilding. On a farm in Sussex, something remarkable is happening. Just 16 miles from Gatwick Airport, an experiment in conservation is creating minor miracles and lots of controversy. Knepp Estate is owned by Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree, handed down through Charlie's family. It's difficult farming terrain, heavy clay sitting over limestone. After struggling for years to sustain farming on the land, in 2000 Burrell and Tree faced failure. The dairy herd was sold, the arable fields rented out. And that could have been the end of the story, as it has been for many other farms. But from 2002, Burrell and Tree tried a new approach, allowing natural processes to take the lead in restoring biodiverse habitats. It's an approach now known as rewilding, and it raises sharp questions about the way humans interact with land and wider ecosystems. On the one hand, rewilding means taking a step back, not intervening, for example, when invasive species seem to be taking a dominant hold, allowing scrub to form and spread, letting the dreaded ragwort flourish. But it would be totally wrong to imply that this is not a managed process. What Tree and Burrell aimed to do was restore a lost ecosystem, specifically one which used large grazing animals as a key element. They were inspired by ecological work which questioned the idea that the ancient pre-agricultural landscape of Europe was all densely wooded. Rather, evidence now suggests the landscape was a mixed economy of more open grassland and scrub alongside woodland. The larger grazing animals were essential to this, clearing space for scrub to grow and for larger trees to grow within the protection afforded, affecting the whole development of landscapes and watercourses. Grazing animals act as a force of disturbance, keeping the landscape dynamic, opening niches for a vast variety of species. Knepp, of course, is a human experiment. Funding had to be found to fence it off and prevent animals roaming beyond its boundaries. The animals themselves had to be introduced: longhorn cattle, Exmoor ponies, Tamworth pigs, roe, fallow and red deer. Visitors are also encouraged but managed. So rewilding is not simply about a total absence of human interaction, nor is it about reversing time and going back to how things were in some past golden age. Rather, it's about learning from ancient mixed ecosystems before the human obsession for industrial farming and monocultures. And it does mean, outside of the grazing animals and the restored water systems, a radical reduction of human-led control, allowing, as I said, invasive species sometimes to spread, allowing trees to stand where they fall or to fall where they lie where they fall, allowing or rather holding back from reintroducing species and just seeing what turns up. And the result has been an explosion of wildlife in just 17 years. Knepp has now more purple emperor butterflies than anywhere in the UK. Bird species, including nightjars, nightingales and turtle doves, are established. All 5 British owl species are present, along with 13 out of the British breeding bat species. But more important than considering each species in isolation is the way that allowing the landscape to a large degree to look after itself has encouraged the complex interrelationship between the herbivores, the birds, insects, water, land, plant species and more to take root. It's enabled biodiversity to explode. These really are networks of life, creative, dynamic and expressive. The lessons are being taken up elsewhere. Rewilding Britain, for example, is leading on a scheme to rewild a huge corridor of land in Wales. Other schemes in Europe are taking off. Rewilding leads to controversy, of course. We like to manage things in this country. Some disagree with the theories about ancient landscape. Others argue that extending rewilding means a waste of productive agricultural land. And when ragwort was allowed to spread, a few neighbours sent in nasty letters. But I think there are important lessons to be learned here. Mainly, how we might actually have hope that the dead hand of modern, intensive, industrialised farming and fragmented urban development could be lifted, and how quickly biodiversity can expand, given the chance. But there are also wider and perhaps more philosophical lessons. First, that nature is not a static system of perfect equilibrium, but one that's a shifting web with open and frayed edges. Nature is both resilience and creativity, an irrepressible openness to possibility. Humanity inevitably has a major impact on other species, land and water, as we know, to our cost, and the cost of the climate as a whole. But human agency doesn't need to be demonised or negated. It can be redirected through practices of patience, attention, delight, rather than the boring and destructive monologue of human control. We can quite literally let 100 flowers bloom. So rewilding, I suggest, can act as both a metaphor and a practical expression of spirituality. It makes space for the other. It's the recognition of our life in relationships that are open, restive, unpredictable, but which also make astonishing new possibilities of life come into being. It listens and responds to agencies and worlds which are not defined by human boundaries. It is inseparable from actually being in touch with the great outdoors, being in the landscape with all our senses open to what arrives. But it's not simply about passivity, and not only for those with excess leisure. We are always, all of us, communicating through the webs which connect us, and always shaping them in subtle and not so subtle ways. Wildness, as an image, encourages us to think beyond the limits of human-imposed plans and projects. But of course, wildness is never pure and pristine. We are part of these interactive ecosystems where we both affect and are affected by nature. Even considered as individuals, every one of us is an ecosystem, persons in relation, and hosts of uncountable microbes and bugs. We are nature in the end. The wildness is always already inside us, if we can hear it. Like God, it is the medium within which we live and move and have our being. So who or what is this wild God? Before we can get to grips with that question, I want to think a little more about how our current ecological crisis is also a theological crisis. How has the image of God in modernity contributed to or been shaped by our ecological brokenness? And what responses have theologians made to this problem which can help us today? So part 2 is eco-theology. I've argued that rewilding is a spiritual practice, an attentive, responsive sense of being in communion with others and our deepest ground. It detaches us from a model of human agency and control that has proved so malign. The trouble is, to use that word spirituality, we're reminded that spirituality itself has become truncated, for reasons which I think are bound up with our ecological malaise. As the world of the later Middle Ages and the Enlightenment reduced the public and material world to what could be measured, mathematized and controlled, so spirit was forced to retreat to an inner world. The separation between God and the world in modernity reflects and reinforces the split between a public world and a private world. Spirituality becomes something personal and private, which has no bearing on matters of ecology or politics. But the way in which spirituality becomes privatized is only apparent. In reality, like any privatisation, it's bound up with questions of property and capital. In the quest for our authentic, proper self in modernity, we not only create idols and ideals of what a proper human life should be like, we also turn authenticity into a tradable commodity. Think of the explosion of spirituality, mindfulness, positive thinking and self-help that now exists. The content's not all bad by any means, but it has undeniably become part of a monetized industry in which you, the anxious modern self, are both the buyer and the product. In self-help, you have to become the entrepreneur of your own life, manage your own spiritual brand. Don't think that practices of self-denial and asceticism ever went away in our world of body shaping, dieting and self-harm. Even self-sacrificial voluntary service is now justified because it looks good on your CV. On the surface, it looks as if we increasingly suffer from various degrees of anxiety, to which various forms of spiritual self-help are offered as the cure. But what if the cure, the obsessive search for the right path to happiness, is itself a major source of our anxiety? Now, don't get me wrong, I still want you to buy my book. We all have to live. We're all realists here. But there is something deeper going wrong with our spirituality than any product can satisfy. And at the heart of it is the reduction of people and planet to raw materials for consumption. Consumption by whom? By humans, yes. The human subject is seen as gazing down upon the world and its creatures, plotting its surface with abstract measures, manipulating its inert matter into culture. But of course, some humans have more agency and subjectivity than others in this particular model. It was the white subject's gaze, for instance, which considered vast tracts of the world virgin territory for exploitation. Indigenous peoples were ripe for colonization and enslavement, since they lacked full personhood. Let's not forget that this was a modern Enlightenment project. The great philosopher Immanuel Kant, who taught that we should think for ourselves, throwing off the shackles of authority, that human beings were intrinsically autonomous, and that moral law was universal, could also write this: humanity is at its greatest perfection in the race of the whites. The yellow Indians do have a meagre talent, the Negroes are far below them, and at the lowest point are a part of the American peoples. In Kant's philosophy, colour becomes an abstract marker for levels of humanity. Now, all this is worth bearing in mind when we consider one influential argument, which is that the blame for the environmental ills of our time should be laid at the floor of religion, and specifically Western monotheism, of which Christianity is the chief culprit. The historian Lynn White published a famous paper arguing just this in 1967. He argued that Christianity set up a dualism between God and the world. Christianity rooted out the old nature-based religions and animisms which recognized the spiritual presence within all creatures and landscapes. According to White, Christianity therefore supported attitudes to nature which led ultimately to environmental exploitation. Now, there's been a huge amount of debate following White's argument, as you would expect. There are a couple of problems with it. First, it treats beliefs about God as the main cause of ecological problems. It does not consider how ideas about God are themselves shaped by wider social, economic and political factors. And second, it paints a very narrow picture of Christianity. It has some truth, it has to be said. But White speaks as if one particular version of it were the only voice to be heard. To be fair to White, though, he does partially recognise this last point. He sees good old Francis of Assisi as embodying an alternative tradition of Christianity and argues that religion has to be part of the solution. He writes, "More science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecologic crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one." Since that time, there have been increasing efforts to push that rethinking forward. in ways that work creatively with aspects of the Christian tradition. Revisiting some of this seminal work recently, it was striking how powerful and relevant it still remains. Books like Jürgen Moltmann's 1985 God in Creation, or Rosemary Radford Ruether's 1992 work Gaia and God, an ecofeminist theology of earth healing. For instance, though Moltmann would have been unaware of the depth of the climate emergency, his tone is still suitably apocalyptic. Even in 1985, he could write of a life and death struggle for creation on this earth. His response to that struggle resonates with the theme of my remarks today. Quote, "What we call an environmental crisis is not merely a crisis in the natural environment of human beings, it's nothing less than a crisis in human beings themselves." For her part, Reuther traces the connections between ecological devastation and patriarchy, systems of domination in which women and the earth are linked together and seen as passive, material, in need of control and direction from the male subject. Reuther is also alive to the colonial dimensions of this exploitation. The eco-theology which emerges from their work and the work of many others in this area identifies the areas where our theological understanding has gone wrong. While they don't claim that it's just beliefs about God which are the cause of those problems, the way they reimagine the divine is bound up with new attitudes to persons and nature. First, God. God, I think the consensus is, should not be seen as a remote dictator standing outside the world and dominating it or owning it. This is a theological distortion in which God is made in the image of the controlling human subject seeking mastery of the world. In response, God is seen as fundamentally in relation which is characterized by freely given love, mutuality, and creativity. Moltmann, for example, offers a firmly Trinitarian vision in opposition to the idea of God as the sole subject and cosmic tyrant. For Moltmann, relationship is not something added on to God, but is essential to God. As Father, Son, and Spirit, God is already in relation. God differs from God's self, and yet exists in mutual integration. For Reuther, a liberating theology must dismantle hierarchies of oppression, and this means rethinking God's transcendence. Drawing on the Brazilian theologian Ivone Guevara, Reuther argues that, quote, "Instead of modelling God after male ruling class consciousness, outside of and ruling over nature as its controlling immortal projection, God in ecofeminist spirituality is the immanent source of life and the renewal of life that sustains the whole planetary and cosmic community. God is neither male nor anthropomorphic. God is the font from which the variety of particular beings co-arise in each generation, the matrix that sustains their life-giving interdependency with each other, and also the judging and renewing insurgency of life that enable us to overcome the distortions that threaten healthy relation." Unquote. For Reuther, Jesus teaches and embodies this non-hierarchical divine. He is the child of wisdom, making healing out of dirt and spit, the wisdom which in the Jewish scriptures is present within created things and delights in the mortal race. There are clearly differences of emphasis between these two visions and many others, but they both challenge the idea of God as a remote monarch ruling the passive world. Such a God mirrors and reinforces the modern notion of the human subject, which dominates and rules over a mechanical, inert world. So if God is always God in relation, then so is the human made in God's image. We are not disembodied spirits ruling over our bodies and the earth, with all the gendered and racial overtones which go along with that. We are embodied persons in relation. Eco-theologians may make use of ideas of stewardship or covenant rather than domination to express our wider relation, but they also affirm the intrinsic worth of the non-human. To echo an unlikely source, Thomas Aquinas, nature pursues its own goods in its own ways. Or, in Moltmann's view, the Holy Spirit indwells each creature and the community of creation. The Spirit is the living creativity within all created things, a spiritual vibrancy which challenges the idea that only human being and human subjectivity have meaning. As created, the world beyond humanity has its own intrinsic spiritual worth. And theologians in the Orthodox tradition, such as Bulgakov, resist the dualism between God and world they see in Western theology. In Christ, all things hold together. All things come from the outpouring of divine energies and are drawn to fulfillment and transfiguration in God. There is a huge promise and creativity in this work. I am, however, struck by one thing. Much of it is still at pains to draw a line between God and creation. It's amazing to me how often the Christian theologian feels the need to name and ward off the threat of pantheism. Pantheism means that everything is God. Eco-theologians usually decry this as heresy and affirm the supposedly more sophisticated idea, which is harder to say, panentheism, that God is in everything and everything is in God, but the two can't be identified. There is an air of pantheist panic, which I find a bit odd in all of this. It's not as if those considered pantheists have really been much of a threat to religious orthodoxy over the years. More often than not, they've been suppressed and executed. Amalric, if you've ever heard of Amalric, worth looking up, was condemned and died of grief in 1207. 10 of his followers were burnt to death 2 years later. So were Margaret Porete in 1310 and Giordano Bruno in 1600. Many other unnamed followers of heresies such as the free spirit joined them at the stake. The foremost pantheist philosopher, Spinoza, I'm going to look at Gary here, Spinoza fan. Spinoza was expelled from the Amsterdam synagogue in 1656. In the controversies which racked German philosophy in the late 18th century, when we had proper controversies like the pantheism controversy, pantheism was a term of abuse. Who wanted to be a pantheist? If you'd like to know more about this, Mary Jane Rubenstein has written a fabulous book called Pantheologies on the ways in which pantheism has been seen as the bogeyman throughout history. Now, on one level, I appreciate why this can be an issue for contemporary theologians. Unthinking worship of what is supposedly natural can be reactionary and naive. In the 1930s, for example, when some German Christians appealed to natural facts of blood and soil to justify their support for Nazism, or when segregationists appealed to natural racial distinctions to oppose integration, we can understand why theologians like Karl Barth stood up and said no to any kind of natural theology. But to characterize all pantheism in this way is bizarrely off the mark. It seems symptomatic of a kind of moral dread, that if we bring God and nature too close, one will contaminate the other, that we will fall prey to paganism. It's seldom a good idea to let theology be driven by fear of the other. In doing so, we may end up ignoring those who challenge us the most, and we also suppress voices in our own tradition, voices which took risks with God and their own bodies, and still have much to teach us today. And it's to those voices that I will now turn, fueled by some sacramental wine. So part 3, the angel and the fly. I want to plant a seed, to turn, however briefly and inadequately, to the 13th and 14th century work of the mystic Marguerite Porete. Porete was a Beguine, a laywoman who followed vows of chastity. The Beguines flourished in parts of France, the Netherlands and Germany at this time. They had patrons, but they also fell under suspicion. They were not part of any formal religious order, relying on local arrangements for oversight. Various edicts issued through the 13th century insisted that they obeyed their parish priest and did not wander around unregulated on pain of excommunication. They were also considered a hotbed of heresy, especially the heresy of the free spirit. This taught that the soul could attain such union with God it no longer needed the church. Porete herself was burned at the stake for heresy in 1310. In 1311, the Council of Vienne condemned her teachings and demanded that the Beguines be disbanded. Now, it would be silly to pretend the writings of anyone from this period can map onto our own political and ecological concerns. There are elements in the world and writings of Perret and similar figures which could be seen as upholding unhelpful dualisms, for example. There is little sense of overt political struggle, but that's hardly surprising considering what happened to her. More striking is the fact that work like Perret's became known or was written in the first place and published. As a laywoman, Perret claims her own voice, her own authorship, and therefore her own authority. Part of the reason that she can do this is that for her, the Holy Church is not as important as it thinks it is. She sometimes calls it Little Holy Church, in a way that must have infuriated the bishops gathered at Vienne. What interests me in Perret is her teaching that our truest identity is divine. As Amy Hollywood puts it, ultimately for Perret, the relationship between the soul and the divine undercuts the hierarchy between created and uncreated by showing the roots of both in each other. The soul's work to create a text that is a mirror of God, the soul, and their unity is achieved only through a fall out of createdness and into her uncreated being." Unquote. It might sound odd to say that a writer who denies our createdness will be much help to eco-theology, but Perret stands in an important tradition in which all things are an expression of the divine. If God is infinite, without limit, then everything is within God and unfolds out of God. God does not create by making stuff pop out of nowhere. God creates out of God's self, out of the infinite possibility that God is. The highest aim for the soul for Perret is to live without a why. In other words, to live without a purpose. Those who live to reach and achieve purposes and goals and targets, like those of us who work in academia, are still obsessed with projects and results. They see the essence of their life lying outside of them. But our goal for Perret is to be like God, who has no goal, no anxious striving after anything, but is simply life and joy itself. God, says Perret, is one pleasing fruition, a limitless bearing fruit. And this is what we are to become, or rather what we realise we already are. For nothing truly is except God. Perret writes, "Nothing is except Him, in love of light, of union, of praise, one will, one love, and one work in two natures. By such divine love, the divine will works in me, for me, and without my possession." This is not the arrogance that the bishops of Vienne thought they detected in Perret and others. For her, the soul lives without grasping, possessing nothing, allowing the creative fruition of God to flow, unencumbered, as she puts it, the unencumbered or unburdened soul. In this state of the soul, Perret says, quote, "The Holy Church does not know how to understand her. Holy Church singularly praises fear of God, for saintly fear of God is one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Still, fear of God would destroy the being of freeness, and perfect freeness possesses no why." Fear of God's all very well for the church, but who wants to live in fear? The soul becomes nothing. The will becomes annihilated. But this is no miserable self-denial and submission. The soul becomes nothing to be filled with God, and Perret finds her own voice in that. While the church and the world busy themselves with works and plans and all the religious and social mechanisms which generate fear, the soul becomes divine, fearless, and loses any need of its own to pursue, to own, or to control. If this is at least an aspect of mystical spirituality, it's anything but purely inward, and it's not just a passing experience. It's a profound shift in perspective, a rethinking and reimagination of God and the person. She may be no eco-theologian, but Perret was undoubtedly a radical and one the church authorities of her day feared. She shifts us out of the human identity we create as a shell for the fragile ego. She calls us to open ourselves to the limitless, life-giving fruition of the God in whom we have our being. And she dispenses with the hierarchies which have so damaged our relationships to one another and the earth. Meister Eckhart, more famous than Perret now, in all probability learned from her work. He himself came under suspicion and investigation for heresy. And I quote Eckhart in the introduction to The Earth Cries Glory, where he writes, "So therefore let us pray to God that we may be free of God, and that we may apprehend and rejoice in that everlasting truth in which the highest angel and the fly," we might add the ant, "and the soul are equal. There where I was established, where I wanted what I was, and I was what I wanted." Equality in God, mystical, political, spiritual, ordinary, post-human. It is simply what we are, what all of creation is, as the unfolding of God's own wild and infinite life. Finally then, and mercifully briefly, it's this vision which increasingly motivates my approach to prayer, to liturgy, and to the writing of The Earth Cries Glory in particular. I wanted to move away from anxieties about pantheism or paganism, because there is actually a huge amount to learn from those ways of thinking and being. The Earth Cries Glory is, of course, only one very limited voice, and it's only one book. Any spirituality will embrace so much more than words on a page. But I think there's still a place for this kind of work, as a pattern, as an inspiration, as an otherness around which we can engage our attention differently. I like written prayers, I admit. Mainly I'm suspicious of the cult of spontaneity, which makes free prayer the dominant or sole model for what prayer should be. Because in my experience, so-called spontaneous Christian prayer often falls into well-worn cliches before you've got past the first sentence, and even clever modes of gaining power over others. So there is room for informality and formality in any lived spirituality. Because words, and carefully composed words, are not just labels, they are invocations. They make space for all that is other to resound. These are the words to give to the wild. The book tries to offer a space like that through orders of daily prayer which run through 8 seasons. And the reason for that is I constructed the book around the eightfold pattern of the year celebrated in contemporary paganism, which centres on the solstices, the equinoxes, and the fire festivals which fall in between. It fits the Christian year better than you might think, not accidentally since the church took it over. It's a reminder that we are engaged in a cycle of natural seasons which profoundly shape our being in the world. So I want to draw to a close with some words I use in the introduction to the book by way of explaining this pattern and hopefully connecting a few of the threads I've touched on tonight. I write that I adopt this eightfold pattern both as a corrective and a stimulus. It's a corrective because we often falsely juxtapose Christian and pre-Christian spiritualities. In fact, the Christian year itself reflects or commandeers many pre-Christian celebrations. And there is a strong tradition of Christian prayer and witness which is rooted in the being or the suchness of creation. It's the prayer of Celtic saints on exposed islands as much as desert mothers and fathers in the scorching wilderness. Theirs was not an easy sentimentalism about nature. In the strangeness and otherness of creation, they sought an abandonment of false living, an exposure to the often harrowing nearness and risk of unconditioned love. Rediscovering the thin places where the divine is present is a reminder that locating God in some faraway heaven is ironically a way of belittling God, locating and defining him according to our assumptions about power and divinity. What's more, the idea that Christianity tends towards the unearthly, or that we should see ourselves as detached rulers and consumers of nature, is a false spirituality, which has surely contributed to our contemporary ecological and social disasters. My claim is that adopting an alternative way of inhabiting the year can therefore be also a stimulus to imagine the cadence of Christian life and prayer differently, to embody spirituality differently. The old stereotype that pre-Christian faiths were cyclical while Christianity is linear, moving from past to future, is hard to sustain. The calendars of the Hebrew scriptures, as well as that of the Christian church, clearly operate with cyclical patterns, and are none the worse for that. They respond to the particular rhythms of creation and food production in ways that expose us anew to something other than our always-on, just-in-time social imperatives of consumerism and seasonless food. Perhaps they may also make us aware of the destructive costs of our alienation from how the earth is tended and how our food is produced. These hidden costs are heavy, both for humans and for the creatures and ecosystems we exploit for our own unsustainable advantage. Finally then, a blessing from the book. May she bless us, may she enfold us, may she guide us. May the spirit of new growth sing with our spirit, midwife our hopes, and forge our courage. Amen. Thank you. So I think we've got a few.
You're going to take questions?
Yes, that's fine. If anybody,
share that yourself, or do you want me to?
why don't you? Because then
Okay.
it's.
Then you haven't got to worry about it.
That's
You can
right.
drink your wine.
Thank you for that natural history of green theology. When I edited Green Christians about 30 years ago now, I wanted to write an editorial saying you can be both Christian and pagan.
Right.
Editorial committee wouldn't let me do it.
Really?
Fear of offending the evangelicals. So I would like to ask, is there room in your communion of saints for people like Sally McFaig, Joanna Macy, Theodore Rojac, and even the Buddha, whose non-volitional actions sounds very much like Peret's living output?
Well, I think there's loads of fruitful connections. Yes, I mean, I'm not going to claim to know all those names. You are clearly more expert on this than me. But yes, absolutely. I think widening the communion of saints is a wonderful way of thinking about that. Not to kind of include and incorporate everyone as a proto-Christian or a hidden Christian,
No.
but because we are part of that web, yes, I think absolutely. So I'm encouraged that you were doing that 30 years ago, despite the opposition you faced at the time. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much. I was really impressed by that. I thought it was fantastic.
Thank you.
I just was interested on the theologians that you quoted and some of the theologians I've been reading recently. Were you influenced by Teilhard de Chardin's theology? I mean, he's not regarded as an eco-theologian.
No.
But it seems to me that, in your terms,
Yeah.
he is.
Yeah.
Because of the spirit in
Yeah.
the fire.
Yeah.
Fire.
Yeah.
The spirit
Yeah.
in the created world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not an inner spirituality, it's
Yeah.
a mystical connection
Yes.
with the created world.
I mean, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I just wondered whether you're influenced.
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, I don't, again, claim to know Teilhard de Chardin's work in great detail. For those who don't know him, he's a Jesuit priest, but also a scientist. Was he a paleontologist? I can't remember. Was he a... Yeah. And he developed this amazing kind of evolutionary account of spirit and of Christian faith in which the kind of cosmic dimensions of Christ emerge over time. It's an amazing vision. I mean, I think, there's obviously questions and critiques you can ask of all of these people, but I think him and the earlier process theologians who saw God as in dialogue with creation. Again, you can pick holes in all of their work, but they're trying to reach for something, it seems to me, that overcomes that divide.
Thomas Merton,
Okay.
I'm a big fan of Thomas
Yeah.
Merton.
Yeah.
Particularly, you mentioned the notion of the false self.
Yeah.
And Merton's writing from his middle period
Yeah.
to later is very much talking about the ego and the false
Yeah.
self,
Yeah.
which through contemplation collapses, or at least is dented. I just wondered whether you read, again, was it an influence?
Yeah, I mean, not directly, I have to say. I mean, I'm aware of some of those writings, but yeah, actually that kind of spiritual diagnosis of the false self, it seems it can't but be also now indirectly ecological and political, you know, because that withdrawal into the fragile ego is so much bound up with that, the anxiety, the disconnection we have. So yes, I think that tradition is really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm far from being an expert in Christianity, and most of you know more than me. But when we arrive to the point of recognizing the divine in all forms of creation, so we arrive to life as divine in itself. So what is the role of God? Why do we need God? Divine in itself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying you need God as an extra thing in a way, but for me, if whatever you name it, life or God, the importance is it's the infinite.
Yes.
I think the inexhaustible. So in a way, you know, names come and go because we can name God, and what we have in mind is actually something that is much more like us, or much more a version of ourselves, a projection of our own fears or desires or whatever. So. You know, there is a place, as Eckhart says, for praying to God to free us of God. You know, when he kind of puts the God that I see as an object, the God that I see as over against, to pray to God to free us of that. So I think the language of God is also kind of an invocation, you know, not just a label to stick onto a reality we've identified, but an invocation into that mystery. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Steve, is there any sense in which we can say that God is dependent on what God creates?
Yeah. Do you think so?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a kind of partnership. And there's a dependency there, but it's probably been heretical.
Well, yeah. I mean, it is something that obviously theologians have really struggled with, haven't they? Because the kind of classical idea that God is unchanging makes it very hard to understand how God can be connected to the world, or certainly, influenced, or how to make any sense of God suffering with the world or anything like that. But I think, even like people like Moltmann, who I think embraces, more orthodox Trinitarian approach, wants to talk about that, introducing the possibility of suffering into God. That, God makes a decision, if you like, for creation, to be in solidarity with creation. If you look at other more kind of evolutionary ideas of God, then there's definitely a sense in which God and the world transcend each other and affect each other. So God is expressed in the world's troubles and travails shape what's possible for God. So God is dependent on the world in that sense.
If there wasn't a world, is there no God?
I don't know. I mean, I kind of like the sort of pantheism, I think, comes out of this sense that the divine overflows into a world, and Christian teaching has not been happy with that, because it wants to see creation as something God freely chooses to do and could have done without. But God doesn't need creation. As soon as you start trying to think of the logic of that, it's very hard actually, because if love is communicative, if being overflows, then there is a kind of inevitability about it, without it meaning that creation is a burden on God or anything like that. So I'm kind of more open to saying that creation is a necessary expression of the infinite. But that obviously puts me a bit beyond the pale.
So Steve, why bother praying? Why write a
Well,
prayer?
I think it is about those practices of attentiveness. And I think there's obviously lots of ways to do it. I mean, although you can argue ultimately God's not anthropomorphic and so on, I find personal metaphors really powerful and helpful. You don't have to use the correct analytical language. So I think it's about being invited into giving attention to what escapes us, what lures us, what provokes us, what seduces us into that relationship with the other. So yeah, I mean, I was like kind of Kierkegaard, who is this kind of Danish writer who's a million miles away from eco-theology, but anyway, he's got a lovely dialogue about prayer where he writes, the person praying starts off sort of demanding a result from God, an explanation from God. Why is this happening, or why doesn't this happen? But in the course of the struggle with God, it's they who are transformed. And there's a lovely play on the Danish word for explanation and the word for transfiguration are really close together. So there's a move from like, I want an answer, to being transformed by that struggle, by that attentiveness.
Stephen, thanks very much. I enjoyed that. I'm thinking about when you said from an environmental point of view, Christians shouldn't see pantheists as kind of opposition. I'm kind of thinking, who is the opposition? Quite clearly there is an opposition.
Right, right.
I wanted to ask you about this. To my mind, the real opposition can, if you look at the sort of theological sources, I'm thinking of the kind of aggressive atheism that one associates with people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. So the logic of it is, there is no design on anything, humans or the universe or whatever.
Right.
So everything happens because the laws of nature just do what it is. And so there's no intention, but intentions and purposes arise with the evolution of humans. So therefore, and this is, as you know, I mean, this is a significant element in academic ethical discourse. Value comes from what humans value.
Yeah.
Right. In that case, what do humans value? Well, it depends which humans you ask, but actually, the humans with the power are saying, yeah, we want to get rid of that. Those ant hills, we could, build something that makes a profit. So, it's realistic. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of Richard Dawkins, it's fair to say. But many atheists aren't either, and find him a complete embarrassment, to be fair. So, yes, maybe that aggressive atheism. So, I think it's interesting then to ask the question, well, what is it about that? And it's the deification of a certain kind of will, which I think you also could find, obviously, in religious contexts as well. The deification of God's will as a kind of separate thing coming into our world, dictating our lives to us, planning, everything's a plan, everything's God's plan, and nothing has its own intrinsic worth. We're all kind of pawns on the chessboard. And it seems to me that that's obviously a very different world from Richard Dawkins, but they're sort of evil twins. They're kind of weird mirrors of each other because they're deifying this disembodied will, which is what decides what's worth valuing and what's not. So yeah, I mean, I think that's, to me, is the broader enemy.
One of the questions, one of the classic comments of theology on environmental issues has been, to sum it up, basically the world's going to end anyway. What's the point? Not that one, I know.
Yeah. It is going to end anyway. Yes, I agree with that. And so are our lives. And I suppose the question then is, why does that dictate the value of something, that it ends? Because it seems to assume that the only thing that's worth anything is what never ends. Well, there are plenty of things that end. Like Liverpool's unbeaten run will probably end. Not for another 10, 11 games, but it would have been wonderful while it's been going on. No, I'm being flippant, but yeah, there's a kind of maybe a philosophical prejudice against things that are fleeting, or that not necessarily even fleeting, but transient. Why can't there be a way of thinking about transience and change, which still gives it or finds in it intrinsic worth. You know, there are people that you could probably think of that you would give your life for. I mean, literally. You would do something that absolute, that unconditioned for. Now you can say, oh, well, they're going to die anyway. Why would I bother? If it's not today, it's in 10 years' time. But you would. So there's something that, it seems that responds to something. In the passing world, there is something absolute. Not the absolute of something static and that never changes ever, but, I don't know, the absolute of a call on us. Have I made that?
Thanks, Steve. I'm sorry I missed the first 20 minutes. I thought we started at 6:30. Anyway, as you know, I'm a great fan of your liturgy and your prayers, so I'm looking forward to the book. And I was interested in Miranda's question, what is prayer? My experience of prayer, which sometimes I put on a par with meditation. I probably meditate more than I pray. But for me, it's more about the impact that it has on me.
Sure.
And on my heart, rather than whoever it is I'm praying to. I have no idea who that is. So that's why I like your words, because they affect me to that degree that I want to pray. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Steve. That was a wonderful piece of work. Thanks. I was so impressed, and I note I'm the only one who took notes. Did you take notes? You're behind me, so I can't get behind me. Cool. Steve, I'm interested in why pantheism is actually so dangerous, and what it's been in. What's happened in history to make pantheism so dangerous?
Yeah.
Is it, in your view, that it does away with hierarchy? And if there's no hierarchy, in other words, one thing is just not more valuable than the next thing, that it flies then in the face of all the established interests that would have us think the way they want us to think? Or is it something else? Is it that pantheism is just actually a truth that is intolerable to think? It is very difficult to think.
Gary's answering his own questions here, ladies and gentlemen.
No, apologies. But, and there was another corollary question that was just...
Oh, you're kind of a corollary question. That's terrible. That's bad conference behaviour.
A little tiny
Go on then.
Which was about anxiety.
Okay.
Because it's true that we're all probably much more anxious than we need to be. But then aren't you moving away from your Kierkegaardian position of celebrating an anxiety? Because anxiety is a way of understanding that you can't quite understand everything, and therefore you're on the path to some sort of wisdom because you...
I mean, obviously, I wouldn't want to... Sorry?
I've got a little bit extra.
Oh, blimey.
Because then, if there's no hierarchy... No, that's not fair. Because then, if there's no hierarchy, then what's wrong with anxiety? Do you know what I mean? It's so dangerous, the whole thing.
If there's no hierarchy, what's wrong with anxiety?
Yeah, anxiety is of no greater or lesser value than, for example...
Oh, right, okay.
Being in a peaceful, meditative, state.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I want to move away from is seeing anxiety as a sort of royal road to authentic selfhood. But of course, we are flesh and blood embodied beings who experience anxiety. We're not kind of angels floating above it all. And there is that sort of friction with the world and circumstances and inevitably things beyond our control, political, structural and so on, which induce anxiety. I'm not trying to suggest that that's a kind of inappropriate response or even something we can necessarily control. But there is a root problem with the hierarchies that generate the worst and most persistent forms of anxiety, it seems to me. So those sort of dominant forms which structure a whole way of living as centred on anxiety. And I think that's what I think is really, really problematic. why is pantheism intolerant? It is an interesting question to me, because it's not as though hordes of pantheist armies have kind of stormed the gates of. Who are these pantheists? What are the? There's a few people that often get burnt at the stake. It's just not great, really. Yes, I think it's a kind of intolerable thought that is supposedly about demeaning God, but I think is probably more about maintaining controlled access to God and maintaining mediation. Now, mediation is not always a bad thing, but certain forms of mediation and access to God can be controlled a lot better if we all agree that God is beyond us, and so you kind of probably need a gatekeeper, and that's going to be me because I'm standing here and I've got the authority to do it. And I think that's the dangerous, the haunting fear that pantheism brings. Whether we can then say nothing's of more value than anything else, I mean, I'm not sure about that. I kind of question that. I think because that implies that pantheism must mean a moral relativism or a kind of a total equivalence. I mean, I liked what Ruther's, I can't remember the exact quote, but Ruther was kind of tending towards that much more pantheistic view in her ecofeminist theology, and saying that life, that matrix of life is immanent, but it's also that insurgency of life which makes us sometimes impatient with oppression or obstruction or whatever it might be. So I don't think there's a total relativism or just acceptance of the status quo in pantheism. I mean, if you look at somebody like Perret, in her way, in her quite radical way, she put herself on the line for a very different vision of what things were about. So yeah, it does threaten. It does threaten, I think. It doesn't just leave things the same. I don't know if that's answered some of the questions.
You answered it with such authority.
Yeah, so write that down.
Thank you very, very much, dear. If you want to be transformed, you can purchase Steve's wonderful latest book at a special